Good evening.
Good evening, Rabbi.
Thank you. You hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, great. So we're going to move on. So it says over here in the Bet Yosef, Katav od Sham Haran. The Ryan furthermore writes there, Gabe Haditana Tanu Rabbanan, regarding that which we learned in Raita, Mevi Adam Kiton Shel Mayim, right? It says there that a person can bring a pitcher of water, Manicho can I get a medora, put it next to the fire, Dafilu Tavshil Shenit Bashel Kol Tzoko, because even a dish was totally cooked, Asulia Tamin Shabbat. You're still not allowed to insulate it, right? On Shabbat. On Shabbat, you're not allowed to insulate. Even if it's something which doesn't add heat, just retains. Because the Gemara doesn't differentiate, right, between one dish and another. It says, nevertheless, לשים כלי על התבשיל כדי לשמרו, to put a kli, a vessel, right, on the cooked dish, كדי לשמרו, in order to keep the from mina achbarim, so it says to guard it from the mice, right? I guess they have mice who were strolling around in those areas. Or כדי שלא יתענף באפרורית, right? Or it shouldn't get soiled, right, from the dirt on the ground. Share, that's allowed, he says. It's not called insulation, right, to heat. Just like to guard it, right? So it's like putting a cover on a pot. Okay, so that's the Bet Yosef. Let's see if we got anything else. I don't think so. Just make sure. No, that's it. Okay. So let's go to Shulchan Aruch. So it says like this: "Afilu tabshil shenitbashel kol tzorko," right? Even if you have a dish which was fully cooked, asul yatmin b'Shabbat, you're not allowed to insulate it on Shabbat. Afilu b'davar she'eno mosif hadal, even something which doesn't add heat. Mekom makom lasum kelim ala tabshil, but it says if you just want to put right on top of a cooked dish, right, some vessels, just you want to guard it from the mice, right? Or that it shouldn't get soiled. Because you're not insulating in order to heat it up. Just to guard it. And just putting a right cover on the pot. So yeah, tonight I was just giving the class in the shul. So I mentioned, right, that there are two things which are not considered to be hatmana, insulation. Number one is if you only cover it from the top, because insulation by definition means it's covered on all sides, right? Top and the sides as well. So therefore, if you're just covering it on the top, it's okay. We're not talking about that case. Number one. Number two, also we're going to see later on, right, in the halachot, that also another thing, which is that the person, right, insulated Erev Shabbat, and then now he wants to serve it on Shabbat, so he has to uncover it and serve the food, so he can once he finishes serving, he can cover it again. So even though he's doing insulation, but that's the original insulation, it's a continuation of that. It's not a new insulation, so therefore they allowed that. That's the so those two cases are allowed. So that would pretty much cover what we do today, So because most people today, what they do is, the people who insulate, they just like use some blankets or some rags, and they put it on top. So the thing is, it's not really going on the sides of the pot because he's covering like the whole, like several pots. So it's just going over the top, It's not really on the sides. So therefore, a method like that would be allowed on Shabbat because it's not really called insulation. It's just covering. Okay, great. So let's move on. We'll go to Gimel. Okay. So it says, these are things that add heat. So we already went through, right, all those substances that add heat, I'm not going to go through them again unless we see in the Bet Yosef, because, or the Shulchan Aruch, because, we don't use those things today, so it's not really so relevant. But I think we're going to see it again anyway, right? Regardless. So it says like this, right? Mishnah Beresh Pek Dalet, right? It's a Mishnah over there. Mem Zayin Amud Bet. Bamet Tomnin, Ubayim Tomnin, right? What can you insulate? What you cannot insulate? And Tomnin, Lo Begefet. So these are things you cannot insulate, right? Why? Because they add heat. They don't just retain heat. So he says, right? Begefet, which we said, right, is the olive pits. Velo bezevel, also not in the manure. Velo melach, right, cannot use salt, and also not seed, right, which is lime, and also not sand, whether it's moist or dry. Ben lachim ben miyashim. And also we said, right, don't use straw. Hey, don't use grape pits. Velo bemochim, right? Also not felt. Velo be'asavim, not grass. Bisman shem lachim, right? When they're moist. But if they're dry, you can use it. That's what we said in the tour, right? It's in the Gemara also. This is coming from the Gemara. Right? It's actually a Mishnah. Okay, so now Rashi explains, right? If you're coming to remove the pot from the stove, now you want to insulate it, right? ודבר אחר, ואמרו חכמים, so the rabbi said, אין מטמנים בדבר שמוסיף הבל. Don't use something which adds heat. I remember the first time I learned this, many years ago, when I learned this Mishnah the first time, my question was like this, how is it really possible physically that it should add heat when it's not on the fire? You understand my question?
Yes, and
How is that possible?
we've talked about this before, and I
Oh,
don't.
we spoke about it. Okay.
I you've tried to explain it. It doesn't work with the laws of thermodynamics, but you told me just to trust the rabbis.
The only thing I can think of, and I think it's true, is that there are certain substances, right, that insulate so well. What happens is, right, that because of that, the space of the heat contracts, and that raises the temperature. Is that possible? What do you think about that?
It doesn't follow the laws of thermodynamics.
Why is that? Why?
You can't take something if something is at a certain temperature, the heat is not going to concentrate. It's not going to get hotter. It's going to dissipate. But
Okay, so let me ask you a question, right? If I take a certain vessel, canister, let's say canister, okay, and there's gas in there, okay. So now, right, if I make that gas, which is inside the canister, right, somehow very well insulated, right? So it, that won't do the job.
So the laws, if you're talking about gases, gas laws, the temperature will go up if pressure goes up, right? There's a relationship between.
That's what I'm saying. So maybe the pressure goes up by contraction, no?
Okay. Gas is yes, but if you're talking about something that you applied heat to, right, and you're no longer applying heat, insulating it shouldn't matter. Is not going to make it higher.
But if I take that gas, right, a certain amount of volume, right, the gas has volume. Now I make it contract. Does that change anything?
Okay, if you decrease the laws of there's different gas laws. There's laws of temperature and pressure. There's laws of pressure and volume. And there's laws of volume and temperature. If volume is decreasing, so is your temperature. Your temperature is going down in a gas. Okay.
So you're telling me that it contracts, right?
But if you're talking about pressure, if pressure increases, your volume's going to decrease. I don't know. I mean, it's possible that a gas, but I mean, we're not eating gases. You're talking about food. Food is a solid or a liquid, right?
Right, but there's also, steam in there, whatever, right? It's, whatever it is. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure about that, but anyway.
I don't know. I can't think of any way in which we could insulate something so well that it increases the temperature.
Right. I have also a hard time with it, it's grappling. I grapple with this,
have it actively, like if you have it on, you have it on a plata. You've had a situation before where your plata has actually brought things to a boil before, but I don't know if that was the insulation. I think that's just the heat of your plata.
Right. That's the heat, of course. Yeah. Because I don't insulate. I never do that anyway.
Right. I can't think of any way that would work. I mean, I'm not,
All right. Anyway, that's very interesting. I don't know. I still don't understand it very well.
Maybe like some kind of enzymatic reaction or something like that. But that's not insulating alone. I can't think of anything that would raise the heat. But that's me being scientific, and I know the rabbis may have been talking about something different.
Right, but what I'm saying is like this, right? That if what happens is like this, right? When it's not insulated, the heat is dissipating. So here's the thing, right? Maybe since now the heat cannot dissipate, it's stuck there. It's trying to get out, but it cannot. So maybe that increases the temperature,
So it would stay at the same temperature. It's not going to increase the temperature.
Yeah, I see your point. That's the scientific way of looking at it. I don't know about that. I'm not really sure. I have to ask a physicist. I don't know. Not really sure. As I told you, right, when I asked my rabbi at that time, he told me, just accept it. He says, don't question these things. So I was like, what did you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that I accept it. It doesn't, I mean, I accept that it's
Yes.
awful, but I don't quite understand how it could work.
Right. Anyway, so we'll leave that aside for now. Right. This is not a science class. Right. So we'll leave that aside. This is not a physics class. But anyway, right, it's an interesting question, but okay, we'll leave that. So anyway, right, as we said, but we don't have things like that today. We don't use them we don't use things. Maybe, right, again, things are coming into my head, maybe there's another thing, which is that when these substances, right, react with heat, it causes some kind of a reaction, which raises the heat. Is that possible? Now I'm talking about chemical, something chemical there.
I mean, if there was some kind of enzyme or something like that in there, but
Yeah.
still, insulating.
So maybe these substances have some kind of a reaction with the heat.
What substances are you talking about?
Like we said, right? Sand, and right, all these things that we mentioned.
So the only thing I can think of there would be is if you had it like in
salt. I'm
like
sorry, go ahead.
had it in the sun, it could be absorbing solar energy. That might do it.
Right, but we're not talking about solar, right? We're just talking about heat. Okay, whatever. I don't know. I'm going crazy with this. Okay, forget about it. Pretend I didn't say anything.
You can explain it. I'd love to hear it.
Okay, so let's go on. Anyway, let's move on. So it says so he said, so as we said, right? If he comes to remove the pot, from the dish, from the stove, and now he wants to insulate it, right? So as we said, right, don't use something which adds heat. Use something which just retains the heat. Fine. So let's move on. Kol davar rach karui mochin. So he says, oh, now he's defining, right? Because before we said mochin, right? So mochin is like rags, So he says, whatever is soft is called rags. Something like that. You're going tzemer, right? What's an example? What do you call it? Wool. I'm sorry, I didn't say it right. Tzemer giffen, right? Which is cotton. Cotton. It's called mochin because it's soft. Right? Utlishet tzemer, right? Also, you have wool, right? What do you call it? Like these, what do they call those? Fleeces of wool. I don't know, whatever they call that. Rach, it's soft. Shel be'ema, right? From an animal. Ugrirat begadim bluim. Also, it says worn out clothing, right? Is also in that category. They're usually soft. The Gemara, Ibailahu, so it asks in the Gemara, Gefet shel zetim, what, right? Tanan. So it says, okay, we included in this the olive pits. About the shum shumin shapir dame. What about, as we said right yesterday? What about sesame? Is that okay, or does it add heat? Or dilma the shum shumin tanan. Or maybe it meant right that those also add heat. Sesame. About the shum shumin shapir dame. Oh, dilma the shum shumin tanan. Does it also include sesame? The kol shaken there's that team, right? And all the more so the olive pits. Tashma, right? Come, he says, come in here. Dama Rabbi Zera, kupa shetaman ba asur le'anicha al gefet. So he says, right? This rabbi says that if a person used like a box, right, some kind of a case to insulate in there, asur le'anicha al gefet, you're not allowed to place it on the olive pits. Shilzetim. Shmamina, you learn from here, Shilzetim Tanan. So that's only, we learn only about the olive pits, right? Not the sesame. Leolam. Imalach. So he says, no, I can tell you, Le'inyan atmana, the shumshumin nami asur. Regarding insulation with the sesame, it's also forbidden. Le'inyan asuke havla the zetim, maske havla the shumshumin la maske havla. So he says, but there's a different thing there, which is that the olive pits, right? What they do is they bring off a lot of steam, right? But the sesame does not. That's very interesting. Yeah, so this language, by the way, a little bit implies, that there is some kind of a reaction sometimes, with the substance that you're using, because it gives off steam. Okay, interesting. Pirish Rashi, the Inyan Atmana, right? Regarding when it comes to what we call it, insulation, letomno betocho doshum shumin nam yasu. That if you want to insulate it inside there, right, with the sesame, also forbidden, he says. Right, when it comes to giving off steam, so he says, for instance, let's say he insulated in something else, and then he placed the he placed that box, right, as we said, on top of the olive pits. So it's not so. Ela shagefet maleh hevel haval. So it's not true, he says. Why? Because what happens is that the olive pits, right? They give off some kind of steam, right? Fumes, whatever. The mala above umartiach kedera shebekupa. So that makes it hotter. Ah, okay. Yeah, so this is kind of like going into our question here, that we asked. Because apparently, right, the Gemara entertains the notion that there are certain substances, when they face heat, what they do is, they give off fumes, right? They give off steam. That's their nature, So it could be that's the reaction, that takes place there. And it's very possible. Okay. Could be something similar to that. For instance, right, one of the substances that we mentioned was lime. Right? Did you ever play with this stuff?
Lime?
Yeah. Like limestone,
Limestone or lime?
No, not limes like the fruits. I'm not talking
I like the fruit.
about.
Lime like the salt. Well, it's a sorry, not a salt. It's a base.
Yeah. Oh, now we're getting there. You said it's a base, right? So bases have a tendency to react, don't they?
With an acid, yeah.
Ah, so lime has a tendency to react to certain things. It's known, right? This is known. So it can give off heat. Am I right?
If it doesn't, that's what I was saying. If there's a reaction, if they have a reaction, yeah.
Exactly. So I think that's what it is. There
Okay.
are certain substances that have a reaction.
That
So we're not in physics class, we're in chemistry class.
So if in that case, what you're talking about, if you're using lime to be, I guess you're saying you're using something that contains lime or has lime in it to
Right.
insulating, then yes, if it's going to react with an acid or it's going to react with water, yeah.
Right. So he's entertaining the thought also of the olive pits that also can have this kind of reaction. So apparently, right, there are certain substances that have a reaction with heat. They give off steam or fumes, whatever it is, right? It's probably that's what it is. Now that I think about it, I'm not sure if you agree with me, but I'm thinking about that.
It would be a reaction with water, and it would be an exothermic reaction. It would give off heat.
Interesting. All right. Okay, that's very interesting.
That's called a fertilizer bomb.
Okay. I don't want to be in the room when you do that one. I'll
in the country.
Let me know in advance so I can leave the room.
No, country shalom.
Okay. Anyway. All right, so here we go, right? Let's move on. I'm going too crazy with this stuff. Anyway, right? Obsession, getting obsessed with it. Okay. Well, mashma the bayan lo ifshita. So it says, right, that this question really wasn't answered in the Talmud. Meaning what? Regarding sesame, right? Does sesame add heat or not? So look what it says, right? Since it's rabbinical, we go lenient, right? That's how everything which is rabbinical, we go lenient when there's a doubt. That's the way it is. Right? But the Ran said, so he says, that's how it concludes, right? That what? He says there is a conclusion here. That what? That even olive pits or even sesame. That's what Rabbeinu Yerucham says. So it seems like there's a machloket here. Rambam also Perush Mishnah. Rambam also says this. So why? Because also the Rambam writes like this, right? We don't insulate in olive pits. Velo chilek ben dezetim lejushumim. So he says he didn't differentiate between olive pits or sesame, right? So therefore, it must be that the Rambam holds, right, that they both add heat. Wow. Mm-hmm. Okay. So then he goes on. So he says, could be the reason is because dilma. So he says, since the Gemara didn't deflect this right notion by saying perhaps, Ela leolam, Emalach says, I can tell you, mashma de kushta de milta achite. So it says, since it says, right, I can tell you, it doesn't say perhaps. So it could be, right, since it says I can tell you, that it's like it's a solid answer, not just right, something hypothetical, theoretical. It's really there. Solid answer. Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Okay, great. Let's move on. So it says, alternatively, so it says, since it's close, to coming to prohibition, Torah, of the Torah, they were stringent, right, even with a doubt. In other words, he's telling you that generally, right, as we said, when it comes to rabbinical doubts, we go lenient. But here, since it's close to coming to a Torah prohibition, it can come to a Torah prohibition. So therefore, they were stringent here in this case, right? It's something unique, not the usual rabbinical doubt. That's very interesting. Okay, great. So let's move on. So it says, as we said this, right? So then it goes on, like the Ran said one time, right? He wrote, it's in the Gemara there, right? Regarding a person who places a dish, right, on the ground, but his intention is to return it, right, to the fire, whatever. And it's still in his hand. And also another case, which is it's in his still hand, but he doesn't want to return it. Two, we ask furthermore, so when it says, right, that it's moist, is that talking about it's moist, naturally moist? Or it's moist from some external source. Tashma, so come, he says, come in here. Lo beteven but lo bezagin, right? You're not allowed to insulate, as we said, right, with straw, right, or with hay, or with right, these outfits. Velo bemuchin, also, as we said, right, not with the rags. Ve'amat lachin mechamat atzman, muchin lachim mechamat atzman. But if you're going to tell me, right, that the moist is by itself, right, that's one thing, and then the soft things, the rags, are something else. How do you find this particular, right, thing there that talks about there? The how the Tanya Rabbi Yoshaya, because that which Rabbi Yoshaya taught, right, in the Braita, Tomnin bekasut, that we're allowed to insulate, right, with clothing, yivashat, which is dry, with perot yivashin, also dry fruits. Right? Aval lo bekasut lacha, but not with the moist clothing or moist fruits. So how do you find, right, that that the clothing is moist, right, on its own volition, right, from itself? Marta de bene atme. Kataram Arif, says the Arif, Vestalkat de mechamat atzman tanan. Okay, we've got a little bit more to go. I think we can finish it. Right, so again, right, the Rif wrote, so he asked the same question, right, the Rif. How do you find, right, that it's wet from on its own, right? The rags. So he says, right, you know how it is? That there's a certain kind of a wool, which is like between the legs of the animal, right? There's like permanent moisture there, in that area of the body. And it doesn't go away. So it seems from his words that when it's moist from its own volition, it heats up more. That's what Rashi says also. Also this Rabbi. Also Rambam, Perush HaMishnah on the Mishnah. So it says, according to this, Lachin mechamat davar acher. Right? That if they're moist because of some external source, mutar, then that will be allowed. Why is that? Because it's not going to increase the heat so much. That the data Rosh, right? The Rosh also says that shkatav ve'azin kula. So he also says, what does he say? We go lenient. He says, right? Because it's a rabbinical prohibition. Oh. So he says we insulate with them if they're moist from an external source. But it says, according to Rambam, he says, he holds right just the opposite, right? If it's from an external source, it gets even more heated up. The asur bechol gavna, and it's forbidden in any case. Because that's what he wrote, the Rambam, he says, right? What did he say? Or zagin or mochim. He said, or olive pits or rags, right? The asavim or the grass, bisman shloshtam lachim, when they're all moist. Even by itself, right? All the more so from outside source. So it says it's a wonder on Rabbeinu, right? The tour. Why didn't he mention this opinion of the Rambam here? Right? Who seems to hold just the opposite. Obviously, the answer is right. He doesn't hold by it. That's why he doesn't mention it. So what does that mean? He holds by the Rosh, his father, right? That's probably what it is. Okay, whatever. Right? And that what he said, right? We're allowed to insulate with clothing and fruits, right? Sham Mishnah, it's in the Mishnah there, Memtet Amud Aleph, Katav Rabbeinu Yerucham, right? So says Rabbeinu Yerucham, Bechelek Bet, Chelek Gimel, Rif Hevi Ha Detani Rabbi Yoshaya. Says the Rif brought this down, you know what this rabbi said. Tomim Bekasud Yevesha, that you're allowed to insulate with dry clothing, with Perot Yevesha, and also dry fruits. But not when they're moist, right? These things. Perot Lachin. Petema, he says, I wonder. The Paliga Matnijin seems like he's right contradicting the Mishnah. He says the Katana is tam tomim beperot v'kasut. It just says right that you can insulate with the fruits and with clothing. It doesn't differentiate between wet and dry. Okay, interesting. Umashma ben lachin ben yevashin. So it says, it implies that doesn't matter whether it's moist or dry, it's all the same. What can I know? Wow, good, strong question. Oh. Okay. So this was Rabbeinu Yerucham. He's asking this question. So he says, even so look what now Bet Yosef, right, comments on that. Even though in the books of the Rif, right, doesn't say that. The Tane Rabbi Yoshai, like this Rabbi Yoshai taught, but since he says nevertheless, since he wrote Kasut Lacha, right, he spoke about moist clothing, the Avida mi Marta de Bene Atme, that's made from this thing there. Right, which is as we said, right, it's from the thighs of the animal. So he says we have to learn that he holds like this. In other words, we have to assume that he holds that way. Why? Because if it wasn't so, why would he bring the moisture of the moist clothing? It must be that he does differentiate. That's what he's trying to say. Okay, we're almost done. And then we'll go to Shulchan Aruch. Look what he says, right? It says, even though the poskim didn't really paskin this, leha, the Tanya Rabbi Yoshaya, which was said by Rabbi Yoshaya, mishum, the pligia matnitin, because it seems like he's arguing on the Mishnah, this rabbi, right? The shara, because the Mishnah allows, tam leatmin, bekasut beperot, it allows to insulate, right, in any clothing or any fruit, doesn't matter, regardless whether it's moist or dry. וכמו שכתבו התוספות, like it was written in Tosfot. אפשר שהריף סובר, so it could be that the Rif holds, the law palig the matnitin, that when it says, right, the Mishnah, גללן דמוכין להכין מחמת עצמן, אין טומנין בהן. That there's no differentiation, that the Mishnah by itself, right, tells us that we shouldn't use moist, right, clothing, which by itself, from itself, we don't insulate with that. Umina nishma, so he says from there we learn the kasut perot, the chol shehen nachin. So we learn from there that anything which is moist, whether it's food or clothing, mechamat atzman by itself, and tamnin, we don't insulate with them. The other tane tamnin b'kasut perot tam, and then taught, right, that even with just regular, right, clothing or fruit, undefined. So he says he wants to say that even if they're moist, we can insulate with them. That means that they're going to be moist from some other external source, as we said, right? Like what Rabbi Yoshaya said. Okay, so he's going out of his way here, right, to explain the words of the Rif, to justify his words. Okay, very interesting. All right, that's incredible. So great. So let's go to Shulchan Aruch Gimel. So it says here, Eluhem devarim mamasidim haval. These are things which add heat, right? As we said, those famous things, right? Psulat shel zitim, right? Olive pits, or shel shumshumin, right? Or right, or of the sesame. So according to the language here, right, we're not talking about the sesame seeds, the stuff that we eat, more the the chaff, whatever, the stuff that the stuff that we throw away. That's what it seems to be talking about. Okay. And then zevel, right, which is like manure. Melach, right, salt. Seed, right, which is limestone, as we said, right? Bechol, and sand. Ben lachim ben yevashim, whether it's dry or wet, moist. Kateben v'zagin, right? Then we have, as we said, right, the hay and the grape pits, the grape seeds, umochin ve'asavim, and then we have the rags, right, and the grass. Bisman shloshtan lachim, but these have to be moist. These last three. These are things that don't add, right? Don't add heat. Kesut uperot, right? Clothing, fruits, right? Kanfeyona, and the feathers of the pigeons. Uneoret shel shel pishtan, right? So then you have the flax stubble, whatever, I don't know what they call that. Right? And then we have the sawdust, as we said, right? So these things do not add heat. So then, right, says the Rama, יש שאומרים דמותר להטמין בסלעים. Oh, so it brings here something which we didn't see in the Bet Yosef. Some say that you're allowed to insulate, right, in selaim, right, which is like rocks, boulders, with God knows. Even though they do add heat. Even though they do add heat, but we don't insulate. We can insulate with them. Why is that? Because something which is not frequent, right, common, the rabbis didn't decree on that. That's very interesting, right? By the way, we see this many times in many areas of halacha, that the rabbis didn't decree on uncommon substances or whatever, or uncommon situations. So here, that's what he's trying to say, right? This is uncommon. So where does this come from? Tosfot, right? And Mordechai. They're the ones who said this. Wow. Fascinating. Question is that the halacha? Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Let's see what it says. Okay, so Mishnah Berurah doesn't paskin about this, The truth is, we don't really need a psak because nobody does this, but but anyway, right? Not very practical at all. But I don't know what to tell you. The question is, right? Does anybody argue on it? It seems like nobody really argues on it. So it could be that it is the halacha because even though, right, it's not everybody mentions this, only two rabbis. But on the other hand, right, nobody really argues with it either. And it is a strong reasoning here, it's uncommon. It's strong reasoning. So therefore, it could very well be that we could rely on that. Why not? It seems so. Anyway, we'll stop here. Thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. Chazak Baruch, Leila Tov. We'll see you tomorrow, B'ezrat Hashem.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All the best.